Lucas returned home at nightfall, with his basket almost full and only a few coins in his pocket. He crossed the narrow streets of the humble neighborhood where he lived, avoiding the mud puddles and the curious looks of neighbors who already knew his routine. Upon entering the house, he was greeted by the tired smile of Mariana, his mother. She was sitting next to Miguel, who was sleeping on an old bed covered with thin blankets. The dim light of the lamp illuminated the pale face of the boy, whose health seemed to be getting worse every day. "How was today, my son?" Mariana asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Lucas tried to smile, but the weight of the humiliation he had suffered earlier still bothered him. He handed over the little money he had collected, saying, "Tomorrow will be better, Mom. I promise." Mariana hugged him tightly, trying to hide the tears that threatened to fall. To her, Lucas was a little hero, someone who carried responsibilities that no boy his age should bear. As Lucas prepared to sleep, his mind returned to the arrogant man who had humiliated him. The image of Eduardo, with his superior gaze and cruel words, awakened in Lucas a mixture of anger and sadness. Why do rich people have so much and still treat others as if they were nothing? He thought, struggling not to cry again. However, deep in his heart, something urged him not to give up. He knew that his fight was not just for himself, but for the survival of his family. That same night, Eduardo was having dinner alone in his mansion. Despite being surrounded by luxury, the silence was almost deafening. He tried to distract himself with the news on television, but the image of the boy persisted. That determination in Lucas's eyes bothered him more than he would like to admit. Eduardo wondered why something so insignificant seemed to disturb his peace. "Maybe I'm just tired," he thought as he pushed his plate aside. On the other side of the city, Lucas finally closed his eyes with a single prayer in his mind. "God, please help Miguel. Show me how I can do more for him." In that night, the destinies of Eduardo and Lucas, so different, began to intertwine irrevocably, driven by forces that neither of them could understand. The next morning, Lucas woke up before sunrise. He looked at Miguel, who was still fast asleep, and then at Mariana, who was preparing a simple coffee with the little they had. The smell of the coffee mixed with the sound of the light rain falling outside, creating a melancholy scene, but one that Lucas faced with determination. He picked up his basket of flowers, now with less than the day before, and gave his mother a quick kiss. "I'll be back before lunch, Mom. Take care of Miguel for me," he said as he hurried out. On the other side of the city, Eduardo began his day with the precision of always. His routine was meticulously planned by his assistant, Clara, who knew how much he hated surprises. But that morning, while he was reviewing some documents in the office of his mansion, something was distracting him. The image of the boy with determined eyes kept appearing in his mind, like an insistent specter. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of discomfort followed him until breakfast, where loneliness seemed even more evident. While Lucas braved the cold and rain to sell his flowers, Eduardo was preparing for an important meeting in the city center. Fate, however, had other plans. As he left the luxurious building, Eduardo saw Lucas again, this time sheltering under a canopy, his flowers almost all soaked. Eduardo hesitated. Something inside him made him stop and observe for a few seconds. It was as if there was something deeper in that boy than he had initially realized. "You again?" Eduardo said, approaching. Lucas, surprised, looked up, but there was no fear there, only the same determination as before. "Sir, I just want to work," the boy replied, ignoring the rain that was running down his face. Eduardo remained silent for a few moments. He didn't know why he was there, talking to the same boy he had humiliated the day before, but he felt it was no coincidence. Eduardo reached into his pocket and pulled out a large bill. "Here, this should help," he said, holding out the money. But Lucas didn't accept it. "I told you I don't want handouts, sir. I just want a chance." These words hit Eduardo like an unexpected blow. For the first time, he saw something in Lucas that he had never seen in anyone else, an unshakable strength, even in the face of adversity. Not knowing how to react, Eduardo simply mumbled something inaudible and hurriedly left, but with the feeling that this encounter had not yet come to an end. That night seemed to be longer for Eduardo than any other. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had rejected his help. Something about the refusal Lucas's presence bothered him deeply. As he poured himself a whiskey at the bar in his mansion, he stared at the reflection in the fireplace, searching for answers that did not come. Eduardo had always believed that money was the solution to everything. But for the first time, he felt that his wealth was useless in the face of that boy's moral strength. "Why didn't you accept it? Why do you keep haunting me in your mind?" he whispered to himself, as if he expected an answer. In the small room he shared with his mother and brother, Lucas could barely sleep. Despite his exhaustion, Eduardo's gaze remained in his memory. He wondered why such a rich man seemed so empty. As Miguel coughed softly in his bed, Lucas promised himself that he would not give up on finding a way to help his family, even if it meant facing more humiliation. The next morning, Eduardo made an unusual decision. He asked Clara to investigate the boy. He wanted to know where he came from, who his family was, and, above all, why he seemed so different from the other people Eduardo had met in his life. Clara, even though she was surprised by the request, didn't question it. It was rare to see Eduardo so intrigued by something or someone that wasn't related to his business. Meanwhile, Lucas returned to the streets with his basket of flowers. The rain had stopped, but the cold remained. He walked along the sidewalks with firm steps, trying to find the right customers. At the same time, Eduardo watched from afar, sitting in his car, hidden behind the tinted windows. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but something about that boy attracted him, as if there was an invisible link connecting their lives. Eduardo finally got out of the car and, for the first time, tried to approach Lucas in a different way. He didn't offer money or ask any questions. He just stood there looking at the boy. "Have you found anyone willing to give you a chance yet?" he asked, his voice lower and less aggressive. Lucas looked up and answered, with the same determination as always. "Not yet, sir. But I won't give up. One day someone will see what I can do." Lucas's answer changed something inside Eduardo. He realized that this boy, despite having so little, was stronger and more resilient than he could have imagined. For the first time, Eduardo felt that he had something to learn from someone outside his world of wealth. But at the same time, a shadow of shame enveloped him, reminding him of how he had treated the boy the first time they met. Clara's investigation into Lucas brought up information that Eduardo had not expected. The boy lived in a poor neighborhood of the city, taking care of his mother, Mariana, and his younger brother, Miguel, who was seriously ill. Mariana worked as a daily cleaner, but the money was barely enough to pay the rent and buy her son's medicine. Hearing this, Eduardo felt a weight on his chest. The family story seemed all too familiar, awakening memories that he had long buried. He remembered his difficult childhood, before his family became wealthy, and the tragic loss of his younger brother, Gabriel, who disappeared in an accident. Determined to find out more, Eduardo asked Clara to accompany him to the neighborhood where Lucas lived. He wanted to see what the boy's life was like up close, but something inside him also urged him to act carefully. He didn't want to scare Lucas or make him think that Eduardo felt sorry for him. When they arrived, Clara was impressed by Eduardo's initiative. It was the first time she had seen her boss come out of his bubble of wealth and coldness. "Mr. Eduardo, I've never seen you so involved in something personal like this," he said. He just shook his head, speechless, as he looked around the narrow, humble streets where Lucas lived. At that very moment, Lucas was on the street, trying to sell his last flowers. He saw Eduardo's car park a distance away, but pretended not to notice. He didn't want to be distracted from his mission. Eduardo, on the other hand, watched Lucas interact with the pedestrians. Even after being ignored several times, the boy kept a smile on his face and continued to offer his flowers. Eduardo felt something he couldn't explain, a mixture of admiration and shame. Suddenly, a scowling man approached Lucas and tried to take the money he had earned. "Give me back what's mine," Lucas shouted, gripping the basket tightly. Eduardo, without thinking twice, got out of the car and intervened. "Let the boy go," he ordered, his voice firm and authoritative. The man hesitated, realizing that Eduardo was not someone he could easily confront, and ran away. Lucas looked at Eduardo, surprised. "Why did you do that?" he asked with a mixture of gratitude and distrust. Eduardo, still panting, answered, "Because no one should go through that, especially someone like you." For the first time, there was sincerity in his voice. Lucas, however, kept his cool. Firm posture. "I still don't want your alms, sir." Eduardo smiled slightly, realizing that gaining that boy's trust would be harder than any deal he had ever closed in his life. But he was willing to try. Lucas' determination inspired him in a way he didn't fully understand. "I'm not here to give alms, Lucas. I want to talk to your mother. I think I can help you, but not in the way you imagine." Mariana was finishing hanging up the few clothes she had washed when she heard footsteps in front of her small house. When she opened the door, she saw Lucas next to a well-dressed man who didn't belong there. For a moment, her heart sank, thinking that something bad had happened. "Mom, this is Mr. Eduardo. He helped me today and wants to talk to you," Lucas said, trying to measure his words so as not to worry his mother. Eduardo, with a serious but respectful expression, extended his hand. "Mrs. Mariana, I'm Eduardo. I know it's strange for me to show up like this, but I want to offer my help." Mariana, although suspicious, invited Eduardo in. The house was simple, with worn walls and old furniture, but impeccably clean. Miguel, lying on a mattress in the corner of the room, was coughing softly, catching Eduardo's attention. He noticed the boy's paleness and Mariana's tired expression, who seemed to carry the weight of all the suffering on her shoulders. "My son is not healthy, sir. That's why Lucas works so hard. We have no other choice," Mariana explained, bluntly, but with a tone of dignity that Eduardo had not expected. As she spoke, Eduardo realized that Mariana was not just describing a difficult situation, but showing a strength that impressed him. He felt ashamed for having judged Lucas at first, without knowing the sacrifice that family made daily. "I can help you," Eduardo said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Mariana looked at him directly, her eyes teary but firm. "Sir, I know Lucas must have told you something. We are grateful for your help today, but we do not want charity." Eduardo took a deep breath before answering. "Mrs. Mariana, this is not charity. I see potential in Lucas. I see strength in this family. I want to offer you a decent job and ensure that Miguel gets the treatment he needs." Lucas stood still, watching the exchange between his mother and Eduardo. He wanted to believe in the man's intentions, but he still felt the weight of the humiliation he had suffered in the past. Mariana, after a long silence, lowered her head, thinking about Miguel. She knew she had to swallow her pride for the sake of her children. "If it's something honest, I accept it. But I want to make it clear, Mr. Eduardo, my family is not a burden to anyone. We work hard, and we want something fair." Eduardo nodded, respecting the strength of that woman. He knew he had taken the first step towards correcting his mistakes and, perhaps, finding something that had always been missing in his life. The days that followed brought an unexpected change for Lucas and his family. Eduardo kept his word and sent Clara to organize the first steps of the promised help. A doctor came to the small house to evaluate Miguel, and Mariana began working as an assistant in one of Eduardo's companies, earning a decent salary. Despite this, the adjustment was not easy. Mariana, although grateful, felt uncomfortable depending on the goodwill of a man she barely knew, while Lucas observed everything with a mixture of relief and caution. At the company, Mariana was an example of dedication, but maintained a reserved attitude. She knew that she was judged by some colleagues, who did not understand why Eduardo had hired a humble woman for a position so close to the administration. However, her honesty and effort soon began to earn everyone's respect. Eduardo, in turn, began to closely monitor the family's progress, something that surprised even Clara. "Mr. Eduardo, I've never seen you so involved. This family really touched you, didn't it?" she commented one day while they were organizing a meeting. Eduardo just smiled, without admitting how true that was. Meanwhile, Lucas did not abandon his routine of selling flowers, even with the initial financial improvement. For him, it was a matter of pride. He wanted to contribute to the family with his own efforts, showing that he did not depend solely on Eduardo's help. One day, Eduardo met him again on the street. This time, instead of reprimanding him, He sat down next to him on a bench in the square, holding a flower that Lucas had offered him. "Why are you still here? Now you have what you need, Lucas," he asked, his voice softer than before. Lucas looked at Eduardo seriously. "Because what you gave us was a chance, not a solution. My mother works hard, my brother is getting better, but we still have a long way to go. I want to show that I can do my part too. I don't want to depend on anyone. I want to be worthy of what you have offered us." Lucas's sincerity touched Eduardo, but it also made him introspective. For the first time, he saw a reflection of himself in that boy, a fighting spirit that reminded him of his own journey to wealth. But there was something more. Eduardo began to realize that his help was not just a matter of charity or redemption. It was a way to fill a void he didn't even know existed. He was learning as much as he was teaching. Eduardo decided it was time to learn more about Lucas and his family story. He organized a lunch at his house, and although hesitant, Mariana and Lucas accepted the invitation. For them, it was an opportunity to thank Eduardo for everything he had done. However, the invitation brought with it a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Mariana dressed in her best, albeit simple, clothes, while Lucas, with his hair carefully combed by his mother, felt torn between excitement and insecurity. When they arrived at Eduardo's mansion, Lucas's eyes widened. He had never seen anything so grand. The crystal chandeliers, the luxurious furniture, and the paintings on the walls made the boy feel as if he had entered another world. Mariana, on the other hand, remained calm, although the grandeur of the place also impressed her. Eduardo welcomed them personally, something that even Clara found unusual. "Welcome. Please, make yourself comfortable. I want you to feel at home," he said with a smile that seemed sincere. During lunch, the conversation flowed better than Mariana expected. Eduardo asked about Lucas's childhood, what he dreamed of being when he grew up. Lucas, still eating cautiously, answered, "I want to be an engineer. I've always wanted to build big things like bridges and houses to help people like us." Eduardo was impressed. That answer, so simple and full of meaning, resonated within him. It was as if he saw in the boy a version of himself that he had forgotten. Mariana, in turn, shared stories of her struggle to raise her children alone after her husband's death. Eduardo listened attentively, something rare for him. When Mariana mentioned that her husband had worked as a driver before he died in an accident, something clicked in Eduardo's mind. "What was his name?" he asked with a serious expression. "Carlos Vieira," Mariana replied, not realizing the reaction the name caused in Eduardo. He froze for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. Clara, who was present, noticed the change in his expression, but chose not to say anything. After lunch, Eduardo took Lucas to show him the mansion's garden. He pointed to an old tree, imposing and full of stories. "This tree was here when I was a child. My father used to say that it was strong because its roots were deep. Remember that, Lucas? The stronger your roots are, the further you can go." Lucas smiled, feeling inspired by the words. Eduardo spent the night restless, reflecting on the name Mariana had mentioned during lunch, Carlos Vieira. He relived confusing memories of his youth, of an accident that had changed his life, and most importantly, of a stranger who had risked everything to save his family. Eduardo vaguely remembered Carlos, but at the time, he was just a carefree young man, oblivious to the sacrifices others made for him. Now, sitting in his office, surrounded by luxury, Lucas' story seemed to be intertwined with his own in a way he still didn't fully understand. The next day, Eduardo called Clara for a private conversation. "Clara, I need you to investigate more about Mariana's husband, Carlos Vieira. There's something in this story that's not clear to me." Clara, curious about Eduardo's serious tone, nodded. "You can leave it to me, sir. I'll gather all the information." Meanwhile, Eduardo couldn't help but think about how that humble family had awakened in him feelings he thought were lost. It was as if, through them, he was rediscovering parts of himself. While Clara continued her investigations, Lucas returned to his routine of selling flowers. However, something inside him was beginning to change. He felt more confident, more motivated to fight for his dreams. Mariana, on the other hand, continued working with dedication, but she noticed that Eduardo seemed distant, almost distracted. "Does he regret having helped us?" she asked Lucas one night. "No, Mom. I think he's trying to understand something, as if he were searching for something that even he doesn't know what it is," the boy replied, with a maturity that surprised Mariana. Days later, Clara returned with detailed information. Carlos Vieira had truly been a dedicated driver, known for his courage and loyalty. What caught Clara's attention the most was an old record that found. Carlos was the driver of the car that was taking Eduardo's family on the day of a serious accident. Eduardo fell silent when he heard this, feeling a mixture of guilt and gratitude. Carlos had lost his life that day, while he and his family survived. "I owe my life to this man," Eduardo said, his voice breaking. For the first time, he understood that helping Mariana and Lucas was not just an act of kindness, but a way to honor Carlos' memory. Determined, Eduardo decided that he would do more for that family. It would not be just a temporary support. He wanted to ensure that Carlos' legacy would be remembered and that Lucas would have all the opportunities that his father never had. Eduardo wasted no time in discovering the connection between his family and Carlos Vieira. The news brought up a mix of emotions that he did not know how to process: gratitude, guilt, and a responsibility that he had never felt before. He decided to visit Mariana and Lucas in person to share what he had discovered. When he arrived at the simple house, he found Lucas playing with Miguel in the backyard. The smile on Lucas's face disappeared when he saw Eduardo, who looked more serious than usual. "Lucas, is your mother home?" Eduardo asked. The boy nodded, but remained still, watching Eduardo's every move as if trying to understand his intentions. Mariana appeared at the door, drying her hands on a dish towel with a surprised expression. "Mr. Eduardo, did something happen?" she asked, trying to hide her concern. Eduardo took a deep breath before answering. "Mrs. Mariana, can I talk to you? It's about Carlos." Mariana stood still, as if her husband's name were a sudden blow. Eduardo got straight to the point, but was careful not to cause more pain. He explained that Carlos had been the driver who saved his family on the day of the accident, and that, without his act of bravery, no one would have survived. As Eduardo told the story, Mariana's expression alternated between surprise and sadness. Lucas, who had been listening from afar, approached, holding his mother's hand. "I didn't know that," Mariana said, tears in her eyes. "I always knew Carlos was a good man, but I never imagined he would have saved lives like that." Eduardo, his voice breaking, continued. "What your husband did was more than courage. He gave his own life for us, and I didn't know how to thank him. For years, I went on with my life, ignoring his sacrifice. But now, knowing you, I want to honor this debt." Mariana tried to respond, but her emotions were too strong. She looked at Lucas, who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Eduardo, we don't know how to thank you for what you've done, but we don't want you to feel obligated. Carlos did what he believed was right, and I just want my children to have a dignified life." Eduardo, touched by Mariana's words, lowered his head, thinking, "It's not just a matter of obligation. I want to do this because it's the right thing to do. Lucas has a bright future, and I want to help him reach it. He reminds me of something I lost a long time ago. Hope." Lucas squeezed his mother's hand tighter, as if silently promising that he would not let them down. 1. In the months that followed, Lucas and his family's lives began to change in ways that had previously seemed impossible. With proper treatment, Miguel showed signs of improvement, which gave Mariana back the hope that had almost been lost. Eduardo, in turn, not only helped her financially, but also became a mentor and inspirational figure in Lucas's life. Their relationship evolved from circumstantial help to a true friendship, full of mutual admiration. One day, Eduardo announced a special project: the creation of a foundation in honor of Carlos Vieira. The foundation would aim to support talented but underprivileged young people like Lucas, providing education and career opportunities. At the inauguration event, Eduardo gave a moving speech, publicly acknowledging Carlos's sacrifice and how this act inspired him to be a better person. Mariana and Lucas were among the guests of honor, visibly moved to hear Eduardo's sincere words of gratitude. At the same time, Lucas began to excel in his studies. Eduardo arranged for him to get a scholarship to a renowned school, and the boy, with his determination, soon became one of the best students. His story of overcoming difficulties began to be told in local newspapers, and he became an example for other young people. One night, during dinner at Eduardo's house, Lucas looked at him and said, "Mr. Eduardo, I promise that one day I will do something as big as the foundation you created. I want to continue helping people, just as you helped me." Years later, the final scene of the story showed Lucas, now a graduate in engineering, receiving an award for an innovative project that helped underprivileged communities. In the audience, Eduardo, Mariana, and Miguel applauded with pride. Lucas dedicated the award to his father, Carlos Vieira, whose sacrifice had started this journey. Eduardo, with tears in his eyes, finally felt at peace, knowing that he had honored Carlos' memory and that together they had created a legacy that would change lives forever.